Hello everyone, I am B. Shobharani from the Department of Biology, Vidhyaashram Pre-University College, Mysore, the Temple of Excellence. Dear second PUC students, in my today's session, I'll be starting with a very new chapter of your syllabus, chapter 2 of your first unit called Reproduction. The chapter name is Sexual Reproduction in Flowering Plants. The first chapter I think we have gone through, that is reproduction in organisms, and the second chapter is sexual reproduction in flowering plants. What are we going to study in this first session 1 of this new chapter 2 called sexual reproduction in flowering plants? We'll be starting with an introductory part of a flower. Then we'll be studying about the different parts of a flower. Then we'll be knowing about the homologies of the flowering plants and the pre-fertilization events. Who does not like a flower? Right? So everybody is fascinated with the beauty of flower. That is the beauty of a flower for a plant body. So what is a flower, children? Flower is a fascinating organ of or a fascinating structure of the angiosperms. As we know, this group of plants called angiosperms are the flowering plants. Or in other words, we can define a flower as a modified shoot meant for sexual reproduction. So we can say that the flowers are the marvels of the plant kingdom. That is, flowers are the morphological and embryological marvels of the plant kingdom, and they are the site of sexual reproduction. So as we know, all flowering plants show sexual reproduction. So what are flowers? Flowers are the organs of sexual reproduction, right? And you can also tell that flowers are the attractive design. That is, the attractive design of flowers, their scent and perfumes, all these add to the sexual reproduction. As we know, the different parts of a flower will enable in the various events of sexual reproduction. So what is a flower? Flower is a fascinating structure of the angiosperms, or they are the modified shoot meant for sexual reproduction, or flowers are the morphological and embryological marvels, and they are the site of the sexual reproduction. And I think we come across a variety of flowers with variety of design, right? So the diversity seen in structure, inflorescence, flowers and floral parts, all these show an amazing range of adaptations to ensure a very important process to happen, that is called sexual reproduction. So all the parameters that are there in the flower will enable a very important process to happen, that is called sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction is what? Nothing but the process of fertilization. Fertilization is what? Fusion of the male gamete with the female gamete, resulting in the formation of a zygote, right? Now, the end products of sexual reproduction are what? The end products of sexual reproduction are fruits and seeds. As I said, flower is a modified shoot meant for sexual reproduction. So what will be the end products then? The end products are nothing but the fruits and the seeds. Right, here you can see a beautiful flower with the stamens and with the stigma. Right, these are the stamens and this is the stigma. Right. Now, what are the two very important units of flower then which helps in sexual reproduction? As we know, the two very important structures that help in sexual reproduction is the anther. Anther is nothing but what we call it as a male reproductive structure. So, male reproductive organ of a flower is called anther, and which in turn produces stamens. Right, and the female reproductive organ of a flower is nothing but gynoecium. Right, anther, or we can call it also as gynoecium. Anther or stigmatic surface with gynoecium. Right, so the male reproductive part of a flower is androecium, and the female reproductive part of a flower is gynoecium. So these two very important reproductive structures of a flower produces the male gamete and the female gamete, which involve in a very important process called sexual reproduction. So the end products of sexual reproduction in plants are fruits and the seeds, right? Now, moving on to the next part of this concept, the fusion of the two gametes, as I said, results in the process of formation of zygote. As I said, zygote is nothing but a diploid cell which will undergo a series of mitotic cell division to become a multicellular embryo. That zygote develops later into an embryo within the seed. It's a very important concept to be noted. As I said, flowers are the fascinating structure of an angiosperm plant. They are the fascinating structures, or they are the modified shoot meant for sexual reproduction. So what will happen when the seed germinates? The embryo grows into a new plant. Right. So as I said, the fusion of two gametes, that is a male gamete and the female gamete, results in the formation of a zygote. The male gamete is called stamen and the female gamete is called carpel. So the process of fusion of these two gametes results in zygote, and the zygote develops into an embryo within the seed. And when this seed germinates, when the climatic conditions are favorable, then it develops into an embryo and later it will grow into a new plant. Next, moving on to the next, homologies of flower plants. Let us understand some of the homologies. So some terms and terminologies are very important for you all children to understand the concepts of this very important chapter 2 of your syllabus called sexual reproduction in flowering plants. As I said, androecium is the male reproductive structure, gynoecium is the female reproductive structure, and the units of androecium are called stamens and the units of gynoecium is called carpel. So carpel is the unit of gynoecium, which is otherwise called megasporophyll. So carpel is otherwise called as what? Megasporophyll, and ovule is called as megasporangium. These homologies of the flower parts is very important for you all to understand all the concepts of this chapter called sexual reproduction in flowering plants, right? Carpel is what? Carpel is the unit of gynoecium. What is gynoecium? Gynoecium is the female reproductive structure of a flower. So carpel is otherwise called megasporophyll. Ovule is otherwise called megasporangium. Then embryo sac is called female gametophyte. So embryo sac is called female gametophyte and the egg is called female gamete. Within the embryo sac you come across the egg where the male gamete will come and fuse with the egg, and embryo sac is called the female gametophyte, whereas the egg is called female gamete. And as I said, stamen is what? The units of androecium is called stamen, which is otherwise called microsporophyll. If carpel is called megasporophyll, what is stamen called? Stamen is called microsporophyll. And anther, within the anther you come across the pollen sacs, which is called microsporangium. These are the terms and terminologies which you need to understand this chapter, right? And as I said, the pollen grains is nothing but the male gamete. So the stamens will produce what? The anther sac will produce what? Pollen grain. And pollen grain is nothing but the male gamete. And the pollen with the pollen tube, later on you can come across male gametophyte. In this beautiful picture you can see the different types of pollen grains. So pollen grains are of various types depending upon the different species of plants. So you come across different shapes of the pollen grains here. So moving across the homologies of flower plants, what is carpel otherwise called? Megasporophyll. What is ovule called? Megasporangium. What is embryo sac called? Female gametophyte. What is egg otherwise called? Female gamete. What is stamen called? Microsporophyll. What is anther called? Pollen sac, or it is otherwise called microsporangium. What is pollen grain? Pollen grain is nothing but the male gamete, and pollen with the pollen tube is called as male gametophyte. Right. Hope you have understood the homologies of the flower parts: carpel, ovule, embryo sac, then egg, stamen, anther, pollen grain, and pollen with the pollen tube. Now, what are the major events that is occurring in angiosperm from the formation of flower to the development of fruit can be studied as follows. So, the major events occurring in angiosperm from the time of formation of a flower to the development of the fruit is as follows. So, we use a word called pre-fertilization events. Already you have understood this word called pre-fertilization events in the first chapter and also in the third chapter, right? So, what is pre? Pre means prior, before the fertilization events happen. So, what are the important things you have to make note of? So, the pre-fertilization events includes microsporogenesis and the pollination. What is microsporogenesis? As I said, microspores are the male gametes. So, formation of microspores which differentiate into pollen grains in the anther of a stamen is called microsporogenesis. So, what is microsporogenesis? Microsporogenesis is nothing but the process of formation of microspores which differentiate into pollen grains where in the anther of a stamen, right? Now, what is pollination? As you know, the gametes have to be brought together. The gamete transfer is very, very important. You have studied in the first chapter of your syllabus called Reproduction in Organisms. The two gametes have to be brought physically together. Then only the process of fusion can happen. As you know, the plants are stationary. So, what is that very important event which brings about the two gametes together? It is nothing but called pollination. So, what is pollination, children? You have already studied in the first chapter called Reproduction in Organism. What is pollination? Pollination is nothing but the process of transfer of the pollen grains from the anther of a flower to the stigma of a same flower or different flower, where we call it as self-pollination or cross-pollination, or we call it as xenogamy or allogamy. So, what are the very important pre-fertilization events? One is called microsporogenesis. What is microsporogenesis? Very important term which is asked for 1 mark question in your PU board question paper. So, what is microsporogenesis? Formation. The process of formation of the microspores or the male gametes which differentiate into pollen grains in the anther of a stamen is called microsporogenesis. And what is that event which brings about the two gametes together called? It is called pollination. So, what is pollination? Pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of a flower either to the stigma of the same flower or the different flower. And as we know, there are different agents which bring about the process of pollination, which we are going to study in the later sessions of this chapter called sexual reproduction in flowering plants. Moving on to the next very important concept of this chapter, that is structure of a typical flower. As you know, a typical flower, when we talk about a bisexual flower, what do you mean by bisexual flower? A bisexual flower has both the male and the female reproductive structure, right? So, when we study about this is a structure of a typical hibiscus flower or a bisexual flower, and usually a flower has 4 orals. A typical flower has 4 orals. What are they? Called calyx, corolla, androecium and gynoecium. What are the 4 very important orals of a flower? Calyx, corolla, androecium and gynoecium, right? Here you can come across. So, here very important is the stalk of a flower. The stalk of a flower is called pedicel, right? And all the 4 orals of a flower. What are the 4 orals of a flower? One is calyx, the other one is corolla, the other one is androecium, the other one is gynoecium. All the 4 orals are embedded in a cup-like structure. Here you can see the cup-like structure. What do you call this cup-like structure? This is called as torus, or it is otherwise called receptacle, or it is otherwise called thalamus. So, all the 4 orals of a flower are embedded in a cup-like structure called torus, or it is otherwise called receptacle or thalamus. Here you can see this is the sepal. So, before we move on, the units of calyx are called sepals. The units of corolla is called petals. And the units of androecium are called stamens. And the units of gynoecium is called carpels. Hope you remember what are the 4 orals of a flower? Calyx, corolla, androecium and gynoecium. What are the units of calyx called? Sepals. What are the units of corolla called? Petals. What are the units of androecium called? Stamens. What are the units of gynoecium called? Carpels. One very important thing you should understand in a flower, when all the four whorls are present in a flower, such a flower is called as a complete flower. So which flower is called as a complete flower? When a flower has all the four whorls. What are the four whorls? Calyx, corolla, androecium and gynoecium. When all the four whorls are present in a flower, you call such a flower as a complete flower. Usually what is the example you are going to give for a complete flower? It is a bisexual flower. Bisexual flower will have both androecium and gynoecium, right? And suppose if any one whorl is missing, one whorl is not present, then it is called incomplete flower. All these concepts hope you all have learnt in first PUC biology itself. You have learnt all these concepts, but just to recollect back, as I said, the four whorls of a flower are calyx, corolla, androecium and gynoecium. What are the units of calyx called? Sepals. What are the units of corolla called? Petals. What are the units of androecium called? Stamens. And what are the units of gynoecium called? Carpels. When all the four whorls are present, it is called complete flower. If any one is missing, it is called incomplete flower. So what is the example, typical example you are going to give for complete flower? It is a bisexual flower. What are you going to give for an example for an incomplete flower? It is unisexual flower. What do you mean by unisexual flower? Either one of the reproductive structure will be present. For example, if it is male flower, then what will be missing? The female reproductive structure will be missing. If it is a female flower, what will be missing? That is, the male reproductive structure will be missing. So, unisexual flower is an example for incomplete flower. And one more very important thing you have to understand. Calyx and corolla are called non-essential whorls. Calyx and corolla is called non-essential whorls. What do you mean by non-essential whorls? Here, calyx and corolla together, they are called non-essential whorls. I'll tell you why they are called non-essential whorls. Whereas androecium and gynoecium, they are called essential whorls. What are the four whorls of a flower? Calyx, corolla, androecium and gynoecium. Calyx and corolla are called non-essential whorls, or they are also called as accessory whorls. They are called accessory whorls. Whereas androecium and gynoecium are called essential whorls, or they are also called as reproductive whorls. All this is a basic which you have to study to understand this chapter, right? So as I said, calyx and corolla are called accessory whorls or non-essential whorls, whereas androecium and gynoecium are called essential whorls or reproductive whorls. Why it is called non-essential or accessory whorls? Because these two, that is calyx and corolla, will not take part directly in the process of sexual reproduction. Indirectly they help the process of sexual reproduction. For example, calyx is helping the flower in the bud condition. So it is protecting the flower in the as a bud condition. Then petals of corolla attract the insects for pollination. So indirectly they are helping in the process of sexual reproduction. Hence they are called as accessory whorls, or they are otherwise called non-essential whorls. Whereas androecium, which is called the male reproductive structure of a flower, whereas gynoecium, which is called the female reproductive structure of a flower, directly take part in the process of sexual reproduction. Hence the name essential whorl, or it is called as reproductive whorls. Hope I am clear with this concept of a flower. What are the four whorls of a flower? Calyx, corolla, androecium and gynoecium are the four whorls of a flower. What are the units of calyx called? The units of calyx is called sepals. What are the units of corolla called? Petals. What are the units of androecium called? Stamens. What are the units of gynoecium called? carpels, right? When do you call a flower as a complete flower? When all the 4 whorls are present in a flower, it is called as a complete flower. What is a classical example for a complete flower? It is a bisexual flower. For example, you can take hibiscus flower, which is a complete flower having both the male and the female reproductive structure and all the 4 whorls. What do you mean by incomplete flower? Any one whorl is missing. For example, if you take unisexual male flower is an incomplete flower, unisexual female flower is an incomplete flower. And as I said, calyx and corolla are called non-essential whorls or accessory whorls because they are not taking part directly in the process of reproduction but definitely help the process of sexual reproduction. Whereas androecium and gynoecium, androecium is a male reproductive structure of a flower which produces what we call is the units as stamens, and gynoecium, which is a female reproductive part of a flower which produces carpels, directly take part in the process of reproduction. Hence you call them as reproductive whorls or essential whorls. Now let us study the structure of a typical flower. As I said, the stalk of a flower is called pedicel, and sepal, the units of calyx is called sepal, and the units of corolla is called petal. So this is the petal, and here you can see the ovary. As I said, this whole part you call it as gynoecium. What are the 3 very important parts of gynoecium? That is stigma, style and ovary. So this slender part is called as style. So what are the 3 very important parts of gynoecium, which is the female reproductive part of a flower? Stigma. This is the stigma where the pollen grains come and fall through a process called pollination, right? And this is the style, and this is the ovary with the ovules. So this is the thalamus. As I said, what is the role played by thalamus? All the 4 whorls are embedded in this cup-like structure called thalamus or torus or receptacle. So the stalk of a flower is called pedicel and the cup-like structure is called thalamus, which holds these sepals, petals, and these are the stamens. Stamens with the slender filament, right? This is the filament. This is the anther lobe. You can see this is the anther which produces what? The pollen grains. Pollen grains are what? The male gametes. And this here you can see the ovule with the carpels, right? So this is about the structure of a typical flower. Hope you have understood. A typical bisexual flower consists of the stalk of a flower is called pedicel, and the cup-like structure which holds all the 4 whorls of a flower is called thalamus or torus or receptacle, and the units of calyx is called sepals. You can see here, and the petal, as you know, the petals are brightly colored and multicolored to attract the insects for pollination. So particularly pollination through insects is called what? Entomology, right? And insects play a very great role in the process of pollination, bringing about the 2 gametes together. As I said, the bringing of 2 gametes together is a very, very important step to happen for a very important event to happen, that is fertilization. And you can see the ovary with the style and stigma and the anther lobe with the filament. Moving on to the other parts of this flower, as I said, the lower whorls are calyx and corolla. As I said, the calyx and corolla are called non-essential or accessory or helping whorls. Why do we use this word called non-essential, accessory or helping whorls? Because they indirectly help the process of sexual reproduction, hence the name non-essential. What are the units of calyx called? Sepals. What are the units of corolla called? Petals. And the upper 2 whorls, the lower 2 whorls are calyx and corolla. What are the 2 upper whorls? Upper whorls are androecium. What is androecium? Androecium is the male reproductive structure of a flower. What is gynoecium? Gynoecium is the female reproductive structure of a flower. And as I said, they are considered as what? Essential. Or they are also considered as what? Reproductive whorls of a flower. Why they are called essential? They are the ones which are actually involving in the process of sexual reproduction, hence the name essential. And because they also are involved in the process of sexual reproduction, we use the word called reproductive whorls, right? Here you can see the picture here, that is the stem here, and you can see the stalk here, the pistil, the flower, the stamen and the petal. Here this is the sepal, right? So This is all about in today's session. So what all did we learn in today's session, children? We learnt about a flower, description of a flower. What is a flower? Flower is a fascinating structure of an angiosperm plant, or you can also define them as what? The modified shoot for sexual reproduction. And flowers are what? They are the morphological and embryological marvels of the plant kingdom, and they are the site of sexual reproduction. We also learnt about the homologies of the flower parts. Then we learnt about the structure of a flower. Particularly we learnt about the 4 whorls of a flower, namely calyx, corolla, androecium and gynoecium. We also learned when do we call a flower as a complete flower. We call a flower as a complete flower when all the 4 whorls of a flower are present in a single flower. For example, which is the example, classical example you are going to give for a complete flower? A typical bisexual flower like hibiscus, right? Then unisexual flower is an example for incomplete flower. For example, like papaya, either it will be a male or a female flower. So either one of the whorl will be missing, right? And as I said, the flower also produces what? The scent, the sweet smell to attract the insects for pollination. Hope you have understood the first session of this very important chapter called sexual reproduction in flowering plants. Moving on to the next session, in the coming session, what I am going to deal with. So in the coming session of the same chapter called sexual reproduction in flowering plants, I will be continuing with the pre-fertilization structure and events. Then we will be studying about the structure of an anther. As I said, anther is otherwise called microsporangium. And as I said, the male gamete is nothing but called what? Pollen grain. So all these things we will be studying in the coming session. Till then, goodbye and thank you.